Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Nerding Out with Nic Bodiford. I am your host, Nic Bodiford. The date is August 4th, 2022. I am joined by Drew Davenport of Fighting Chance Fantasy, Football Guys, and his podcast, The Auction Brief. He is a legal mind that we all turn to when we have news breaking. But we don't have to talk about news today. Today, we are focusing solely on auctions.
I'm Watson'd out, man.
There you go. Yeah. No, we're only having fun here today. So, Drew, how are you?
Fantastic, man. Thank you for having me. You've been a huge supporter of mine since the beginning. Always retweeting my stuff, and can't thank you enough for that. So I'm happy to do this for you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so we are going to basically cover the basics of an auction draft. We're going to talk about how people should plan. How you should approach it, what you should be doing in the draft, and at the end we'll maybe touch on a couple players that Drew's looking at. But first things first, Drew, you have a tool that you use that you refer to as the par sheet. Can you tell everybody what the par sheet is?
Yeah, that's a name I gave to it. I'm not sure that the thing itself is super innovative, but I gave it that name because it was always something that was in my head. That's how I thought about it. Like, oh, I'm a few dollars behind par or whatever. So then I started calling it that because it was maybe, I don't know, 15, 18 years ago when I was in a draft and I realized that I was sort of adrift, sort of didn't know what I was doing in the middle of the auction about which way I was going to go. And I realized I really needed the definite numbers in front of me about how much I wanted to spend at each position. So the following year, I ended up just writing exact numbers down. And honestly, it took a few years before I kind of felt comfortable like missing on those numbers and being over and under. But then I figured out that the par sheet was perfect for that, because if you had said, hey, I want to spend 30 on this position, and then you spend 32, you know that you're a little bit behind from your sheet. So the reason I call it a par sheet is as I go through the auction, I have my exact numbers there, but then on the other side of the paper, if I pay over or under, I write that out to the side and I keep the tally running through the whole draft. So for example, if I said I want to spend 30 and I spent 34, I would go out and I would write -4, and then I would circle that because that's where I currently am. And then on the next guy, let's say I wanted to spend 20 and I spent 18, I gained $2 back. So I would say, okay, I was at -4. Now I'm at -2. So I scribble out the -4, write the -2, circle that one. That's where I know. And the reason I say that, like, I know that sounds like, oh, okay, well, that's amazing, Drew. You write a number at the side. But the reason I think it works so well is because it always tells you where you are in the auction, because you can glance at two things in the heat of the moment when you're trying to decide whether or not to bid. And those two things tell you everything you need to know. Number one is, how many spots do I need left to fill on my sheet? And number two, where am I to par? And the reason that relationship's so important is if you're like -7, you know, if you have most of your team to fill, you can make that up. If you're -7 and you have 3 guys left, you're in trouble. So there's a relationship there, and you can always at a glance see, how many do I need? Where am I at? And it's super accessible in the heat of the moment when you're bidding.
And you prefer, you mentioned this, that you'll scribble. You prefer doing this by hand. Like you find it that it helps you to kind of have hands on rather than doing this through a spreadsheet.
Yeah. And I don't know if that makes me an old man yet, but I love, so I have a computer program. I use the Draft Dominator from Football Guys. I know I work for Football Guys, but I've been using that since I started auction drafting 20 years ago, whenever they came out with it. So I'm not here to plug the Draft Dominator. I think it's the best software out there. So I would go get that if you would, if you can. If not, an Excel spreadsheet or whatever, I have that going, but I like the par sheet to be sitting right there in front of me. So I'm not flipping back and forth between windows on my screen, and I can just glance down and see I'm +9. Let's go for it. Something like that.
Do you do you have specific play for your par sheet? Do you budget out by like ambiguous, like by running back one, or is it by Jonathan Taylor?
No, I just say RB1. And then I have a range of guys that I think is acceptable for that spot.
Cool. All right. So my experience, no, you're good. My experience is, with auction drafts is fairly limited. I've been doing them for a few years, but I'm in the state of Washington, and so we don't have gambling or skill games, however we are supposed to phrase it. We don't have those here, so I always have to like travel, go do drafts where I can in Oregon or something. So and normally I'm doing redrafts when I'm doing those, just snake drafts. But one thing that I can kind of play mind games on myself with is the nomination process. And I think my intuition tells me right off the bat, nominate guys that I don't want, that I think my opposition might want. I have, if I recall correctly, have heard you speak against this idea. Can you talk about the do's and don'ts of the nomination process?
Yeah, so you hit on the big one that I have been kind of harping on this summer, and I don't want people to think that that's never the right play. So sometimes it is the right play to nominate a big player that's going to draw money. Sometimes that's the right play. But there's two things I would say about that. Number one is that oftentimes it's better to tie up that money in somebody's brain than it is to actually tie up the money physically. And why is that? Because there's multiple drafters in your room who are going to be thinking about that player. So let's say, for instance, Jonathan Taylor has been nominated and you expect him to go for $70. If you leave him out there, there's 3, 4, however many players in the room think they're getting Taylor. Even if it's just 2, they have that $70 tied up in their brain. You've actually, let's say that there's 3 people that want Taylor. You effectively tied up $210 in cap by leaving him on the board rather than just letting one guy have him for 70. That frees up 2 other guys to go spend money on somebody else. So that's number one. Number two would be, I don't like doing that early because I want to know which one of my par sheets is going to work. And I go into a lot of drafts thinking I'm going to get this top tight end or I'm going to get this running back. And if I don't, it changes my strategy. And the problem with the, hey, nominate and draw money out thing is that you're not defining your own strategy. While it's okay that somebody spends some money, you're not actually pushing your par sheet one way or another. And what ends up happening is you get behind. So you only get one nomination around. And the biggest thing I want to say about nominations, like this is a sidetrack, but I got to say it. You don't control much in an auction. Why give up that opportunity by just being like, oh, who's the top guy and picking him? That's not control. You only have one nomination around. You only have a limited number of nominations through the auction. Use them to your benefit. So back to the point, which is your benefit early on is, where am I going with my draft? I wanted Travis Kelce. Am I going to get him? Don't wait for somebody to nominate him. Nominate Kelce. You're not getting a deal. You're not going to wait till the 16th round to get Kelce for $9. That ain't happening. Just not get him out there. Know if you're getting him or not. Then you know which way you're going. So I think that's important too.
And so you like right off the bat, your first pick, you will put someone out there who you are pursuing.
Absolutely. And not only the first one, but what I'm going to do is if I'm in the top half of the first round, I know you've heard me as a loyal listener of the show. Yeah.
You've heard me talk about the sitting down bonus. Yeah. If I'm in the top half of the first draft, I'm going immediately for a guy that I think that people are a little bit down on, but that I really want, who's sort of an elite player, but not quite top. Like if you call out Taylor, everybody's going to be in. But if you call out this year, I'm looking at like say Dalvin Cook or Joe Mixon in that spot. So if I'm the top half of round one, I'm just going to go right for Dalvin Cook because everybody's like, there's like 9 RB1s that I want in addition to Cook. They're just not going to be that excited about him. And because there's a little bit of uncertainty around him, because they don't follow me. So most of your league's not going to know that Cook is fine. He's not going to get in trouble this year. So I'd call out Cook and be like, okay, not only can I compound, the early jitters, but I can compound the kind of lack of awareness about Cook's situation, hopefully pull off a deal right away. And then maybe I'm locking up my RB1 immediately. And then I know what I can do from there. Cool. Okay. Do you price enforce? Do I price enforce? Yes, but I put a big caveat out there. I would not be doing any price enforcing if you're not very comfortable with the auction process. If you are new to it or you're a little bit unsure or whatever, don't price enforce. It can ruin your draft. And there's nothing worse than like being 20 minutes into a draft and then you get caught price enforcing and it screws up your entire auction. That's just not fun. It could ruin your season. And it's definitely going to stick with you for a while during the draft. You're going to perform poorly after you get stuck with somebody you didn't want. So I advise not doing it.
On the other hand, I do think that there's a big difference between price enforcing and trying to just bid people up. So sometimes the market is just wrong. And I say, like, I was never going to have this guy. And then the room gets silent at 15. And I'm like, 16? Like, what are we doing here? This guy's worth 28. Like, why is he stopping at 15? So that's market, So when you say price enforcing, that is to me strictly the price enforcing that you want to do is when a player is just going way too cheap. Get in there and make sure that you bump it a few bucks. And if you get him, then you got him way too cheap. And if somebody else takes him off of your hands after you bump it a few dollars, at least you made the price get a little bit more palatable. But bidding people up really requires you to know somebody and know what the price is going to be. Bidding people up for the purpose of not price enforcing is just a super risky strategy. I don't advise people doing it.
Well, so my first thought here is this is where the par sheet would be really helpful, where in your example, if someone is going for $15 and you actually have that position, you've got somebody as a wide receiver 2 and you've got that position budgeted for 28, you can know to price enforce right up until that max, and then you're done and someone else can take them.
Yeah. And what I love to say about the par sheet is, and it's something that really popped into my head this summer when I was doing some prep for one of my shows. I said, it gives you all the answers. It always gives you the right answer because in that moment, hey, this guy's a good wide receiver too. I had 28, but you know what I love about auctions? And it's actually even better than that because, hey, I had 28 for my wide receiver 2. It might be that you had like 18 for your wide receiver 3. And if you did, you're suddenly getting a wide receiver 2 for your wide receiver 3 spot. And then again, that's where the par sheet comes in and tells you, holy cow, I can slot this guy into my wide receiver 3 that I never thought I'd be able to get.
Cool. Is there, so touching on a thing that I brought up earlier, is there a way to actually bait people? Have you found a consistent tactic in getting people to make the wrong call?
Yeah, yes and no, but it's pretty unreliable. But I would say that the first thing it requires is really knowing the person and knowing the room. If I go into just an auction with a bunch of random people, like when I go to King's Classic, I know those guys I've been in there for a couple of years, but I don't know them well enough to be doing that stuff. And I don't know them well enough to be predicting their behavior yet. I don't have a grasp of the room. So it takes a real strong grasp of the room. But the ways that I found that I can do it, there's a couple of different ways. One is a targeted nomination for what they want on their roster. And sometimes you'll find players that are managers that have a specific player affinity, like they love Keenan Allen or they love, Chargers, or they love whatever. You can do targeted nominations that way to sort of pick on a certain player to force them to act. And a lot of times you want to do that when you see somebody's got too much money. I like to be the one with, the most or top 2 or 3 money as we're going through. If I see somebody just hanging out, I'm going to start throwing bids to target their roster. The other thing I notice is that there are some really aggressive auction drafters, and you'll know it instantly when you see them, how they bid. And a lot of times you can get them in a like back and forth where they fall into a cadence where you're like 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, and it goes super fast. And then get them up to an uncomfortable or nearly uncomfortable price level and then just stop. And then they're like, oh God, we were doing a thing and now we're not doing the thing anymore. So you find an aggressive player and they might do that. That's something I've seen several times in recent years.
Okay. So you actually touched on the next thing we're going to talk about. You kind of touched on this earlier, but is there a player, an archetype or what have you that the field usually, or the market usually gets wrong? And the example that you kind of touched on was Dalvin Cook, where he's probably not getting suspended this year. Alvin Kamara is probably a similar one. Do people get, is there a more broad, or are there more categories that people tend to get wrong, and how do you attack those positions?
Well, let me say you touched on one of them in the show sheet about previous year injuries. That's one of the things that I find in auctions is really odd. It creates this sort of recency bias that, like Russell Wilson, he's a perfect example. He got hurt last year. Before he was hurt, he was his normal, efficient self, just playing on a run first offense. So that's the kind of thing I look for. I don't really want guys that are already hurt coming into the year. But I do look at guys who got hurt last year, and then they're sort of out of people's brains, and so they fall more than they should. But generally, to the position groups, I have a couple different comments. I would say, first of all, people always pay for Justin Tucker, Harrison Butker, the Rams defense. Like, you don't need to do that. There's no reason for that. And people say, well, Tucker is XYZ. I don't care. Tucker was 8th in points per game last year for kickers. There's no reason to pay more than $1. You could just pay $1 for me as your fantasy kicker and then go up after 2 weeks. There'd be some guy who's tearing it up. Like, we didn't know who Rodrigo Blankenship was 2 years
Right.
ago.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden he went berserk and he was on a lot of teams. So you can find that stuff. Anyway, so I won't belabor that point. I also see a lot of people, they spend way too much money on their backup quarterbacks and tight ends. That spot is too rich to pick up a couple players late in the draft for you to be spending. Hey, let's say, you got Kyler Murray for $16 and then you went and spent $6 on Derek Carr. You should not be doing if you go for a decent quarterback, don't even draft a backup or draft a $1 backup. Just don't be doing that. Don't be dumping $5-6 on your backup tight end, backup quarterback. And then the last thing I would comment on is I don't understand this, and it still happens in the most veteran draft rooms. Running back points are valued higher than wide receiver points. And I understand the scarcity argument. I totally get that. But I can buy so many more fantasy points at the wide receiver position in an auction for a set price than I can running backs. And so, again, I understand why. I get the argument. I understand that there's only very few, and you can find a bunch of wide receivers that can produce, but wide receiver points are cheaper than running back points in an auction.
I think we see that overpriced trend coming into play in snake drafts when we get into the running back dead zone, where it's these guys who were not good enough to be drafted in rounds 1 and 2, but you still got projectable volume, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
There was on the point of only getting, like, if you get an elite quarterback or tight end, not investing highly in the backup, is that just because basically you're not going to be able to replicate the starter's production in the event of an injury? So, if you're not first, you're last. Why would you not want to?
Because you can't. You've already spent money. Josh Larkey is a guy that put this well. I mean, I had this idea in my head, but he really put words to it well. He said, if I invest in a guy like that and then I lose them to injury, there's no way to ensure that you're getting that type of production. So you really just have to count on them being healthy. And if you lose Kyler Murray, then you're going to have to go to the wire and cobble together production and good matchups the rest of the way. And it's okay if, like, you want to spend, like, hey, you're getting to the end of an auction and you realize that Derek Carr is still out there and you can get him for $3 because you have a bunch of extra cash. Like, that's fine. That's not a big deal. But my point is, I don't know that you can get an elite producer for a reasonable price as your backup. So you're not going to touch that production. You're going to end up cobbling it together from the wire anyway. So just hope they're healthy.
Yeah. Okay. So we covered the next. We just got two birds stoned at once there. Which types of players are you willing to spend $50 or more on?
Oh gosh. So short answer, none. I know that's weird. But
no.
So in more shallow leagues, I come back to this. So we were talking about quarterback and tight end. In more shallow leagues, I might spend a little bit more on the quarterback and tight end, and then that ends up pulling money from running back and wide receiver. So I don't end up spending that 50 anyway. And then on deeper leagues, I'm almost never paying for the quarterback or tight end, but it's so deep that you have to go deep into your roster. So again, I don't end up with the $50 players. So last year, I would say I used the Kings Classic as a deep league example. I know I talk about it a lot. People are probably like, okay, dude, enough. But it's a 14 teamer. That's why I reference it. And last year, I ended up getting Eckler for 41 and Adams for 42. And those were exactly what I want to spend. I want to spend low 40s to mid 40s for the archetype of an RB1 or a wide receiver one. So I thought that Eckler could be a top 5 producer for a bottom RB1 price. So, and that's exactly what happened. I got lucky. I'm not saying I'm amazing, but those are the guys you want to look at. You want to look at the bottom 5 RB1s and say, which one of these do I think can leap up? And I know that that price is going to be more palatable, because you're going to get a big cliff between McCaffrey, Taylor, and a few of those top guys. I shouldn't say big, but it's going to be noticeable where you're going to see that 50 come in under 50, and all of a sudden it slides into 40, low 40, upper 30s, even for guys like Aaron Jones, Javonte Williams, Nick Chubb type guys. And I'm even okay going into some of those drafts and going, hey, I'm just going to do, Nick Chubb as my RB1, even though I know people that makes people cringe. But like, hey, if I can get him for $36, then that allows me a different build at wide receiver. So that's a long answer, but I hope I answered the question.
Yeah. I mean, to your point, I was just looking at Fantasy Pros, their current auction ADP costs, and there's only one wide receiver, Cooper Kupp, going for over $50. With the running backs, we're looking at JT, CMC, Eckler, and Henry. And man, I mean, just as an aside, I'm totally out on Henry this year, but
Me too.
Yeah, okay. Especially at 56.
Yeah. Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that when it gets to that point, you have to make hard decisions. And it's something I talked about recently about when you're making up your par sheet. If you say I'm going to spend $60 on a running back, like that's okay. I don't have the market cornered on the exact way to do an auction. You can succeed a bunch of different ways, but I don't like the build I have to come up with in order to spend that amount of money on one player. The build gets super thin, and that's not how I build teams. So that's just my personal preference. But if you're going to do it, you got to make some hard choices at the back of your roster about how you're going to go.
So speaking of builds here, are there builds that you target? You did mention that very briefly that you will switch to a different par sheet. So do you come up with more than one that's, one is like elite tight end, one is anchor RB, et cetera, et cetera?
Absolutely. So I usually have, God, I went crazy one year and had like 5 when I went into the draft, but it didn't work. It was too much. So I think having 2 or 3 is nice, because I do a lot of live auctions. That's weird. Not a lot of people do. I do 3 live auctions, and then I do 10 and 12 teamers a lot. So I've got a couple 14 teamers, but I do 10 and 12 teamers. So what I figured out is that the builds in those leagues allow me more, how do I want to say this, more flexibility in different ways to attack it. So I feel like in a super deep league, a 14 teamer, I kind of only feel like there's really only a couple ways to get to the end where I like my team. But in a 10 teamer, I feel like there's 10 ways I could do it. Like I could buy Jonathan Taylor and Cooper Kupp and then just pay nothing at quarterback and tight end and have like 3 just rando wide receivers. But so cutting to the chase, I believe that the favorite build that I've come up with, and it's something that may change here in the next couple of years because I'm starting to notice a trend of too many people going after wide receivers. But my favorite build is I like 4,000 wide receivers. I like I have a problem with wide receivers, but there's a legitimate reason for it. You can miss on some of these guys. Last year, Allen Robinson, I had Allen Robinson on a lot of teams. When I missed on him, I had Robbie Anderson on quite a few teams. So when you miss on a guy like that, if you've drafted 5 receivers you like, you miss on a guy you're still starting 4 you like. Yeah. So my build has been typically in shallow leagues, I'm going for a valuable quarterback that's not a top tier guy, but not a bargain basement guy. So I'm looking at this year guys like Stafford, Russell Wilson, Dak Prescott. Those guys are falling right in that value gap. And then at tight end, I'm going pretty cheap. I'm not hitting the tight end in those shallow leagues. Now, I will come up with a par sheet where I can buy Kelsey or Mark Andrews. I will do that in a shallow league because it is possible. But that's not my favorite build. My favorite build is to go cheap at tight end, find the value gap at quarterback. I want one running back. I'm not going to be drafting one of the top guys. So I'm going to end up with a Joe Mixon, a Dalvin Cook, and Aaron Jones, somebody like that as my RB1. and then I'm bailing completely on the rest of my running backs. And when I say bailing completely, I mean bailing. Like I will have like $14 on my RB2. Like I'm
Yeah.
getting a piece of crap for my RB2, and I'm hoping to spend less than that. And I'm going to try to get 3 guys like that for like $25, like 3 guys that I just know that I can just stick some, jag in there once a week, just a guy once a week it doesn't matter whatever matchup works, or I can get a guy off the wire. I do not care about the rest of my running backs. And then I'm going to spend a lot of my cap at wide receiver. And a lot of people find that odd, but I'll spend 110, $120 on my wide receivers. And I'm going to try to throw all of that at like the top 5 guys. I love doing things like trying to get a wide receiver who's basically a 2 and making him my 4. Like I get excited
Yeah.
about that. So that's what I do. I throw a bunch at wide receiver and then bail out of RB2, get a good RB1, and then cheap at tight end, value QB.
Yeah, I think Sean Siegel refers to the 4 wide receiver as winning the flex with a wide receiver. That's
Yeah.
a big part of his 0 RB mantra. Just following up a point that 2 points that you made. One, I am looking at auction costs right now, and I can see exactly what you're talking about, where there's suddenly this big drop off in the beginning of the next tier. It looks like Burrow might be at the top of that right now. Stafford is at 11, but why is it that you don't attack the elite tight end position?
Well, my problem is I will go every summer and I'll live in like my little dream world where I'm like, I'm going to get Travis Kelce this year. And then I start building my par sheet and I just never like where my team where it goes.
Okay.
Even when I'm in a snake and I take Kelce at the 1-2 turn, I just don't like the builds. I don't like how I have a hole somewhere else. And then you're counting on Kelce to be that difference maker. Now, a couple of years ago, when I was lucky enough to get him at the end of the first round turn here in a 12-teamer, he was fine, but he wasn't the difference maker that I wanted him to be to have the hole somewhere else. So I will say this: I have a couple 10-team auctions. I do go for those guys, but in the past, it's been, hey, I think I can get. So I'm in one that's a $300 cap, and I went in there thinking, okay, if I can get Kelce for less than $60, I'm doing it. And then he was like 74, and I just thought, I'm not spending, that's like 30% of your cap on Travis Kelce. So it ends up every summer where I walk into the room with a tight end heavy par sheet in my 10-team auctions, and it just never works. So it's not that I don't want to, it's just that everybody's excited about those top couple guys. It doesn't work.
Okay. All right. So a very specific question, but I think that it's generally applicable to leagues that have been going on for a long time. On a podcast that you had earlier this summer, you had the aforementioned Josh Larkey join, and you asked him about his strategy in a draft that you two had participated in. And what he said was that he doesn't consider himself to be that strong of an auction player. And so he looked around the room and he identified who he thought the strongest player was, which was you. And he said, okay, whenever I think Drew is going in on a guy, I am going to make it my job to take that player from him. If you had known he was going to do this beforehand, how would you have dealt with that? Because I think that we see, rivalries and things build up in some of these long-term leagues. And I think that knowing, if someone's got it out for you, I think that this is a common situation people can get in, and I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, first of all, it's flattering from Josh. When he said that, I was kind of blown away. Josh is about half my age, but he's a smart dude. So I respect what he does in the fantasy space. And to hear him say that was a huge compliment. But, I tell you what, it is hard, because if I had known that ahead of time, I don't know what I could have done about it. Having said that, I did notice about halfway through that he was tailing me on some things. And I remember a couple of years ago, in one of my home leagues, I had Patrick Mahomes. This is a best ball league, but we have in-season management. It's a weird league, but I had Patrick Mahomes as one of my keepers, and I was going for Mecole Hardman before I realized that he sucks at football.
Yeah.
But I was going for Hardman just because it's a best ball, and I'm like, if I have these 2 guys, like it'll be dynamite in a couple of weeks. And a guy started bidding me up on him. And I thought, I don't think this is a coincidence. Like, he's bidding me up because he knows I have Mahomes. And so I kept going, and then at a certain point, I just stopped, and he got him. I think he was a little surprised, but then it happened again later in the draft where he's bidding me up on a guy, and I'm like, this guy is definitely tailing me. And so I just got him. He was one of those sort of like impulsive guys. And so what I did was I made sure and bid really quickly on this guy, and then I stopped and stuck him a second time. He hasn't messed with me since. That's been 2 years. And I don't know that like it wasn't like a mean spirited thing that he was doing. I think that he genuinely was interested in those players, but he knew that I was too. So he was paying more than he should have. So I guess the answer to your question would be, I think that I would start targeting nominations at that player, and I would start acting as though I was interested when I'm not. And online, that's really tough. So it's more of a targeted nomination thing online. But what I would do is something like this, like, okay, I noticed what Josh was doing to me in that draft was we were both waiting on this big receiver, like this mass of receivers from wide receiver 15 to 35. Like we were both waiting on the price to come down and that big glut there. And I saw it happening. I'm like, and then he kept like, I think I was getting a guy for 7 and he'd go 8. I'm like, God, this is what's happening. So I think what you do is in that situation, you nominate what you think. This is like 3 levels, but nominate what you think that he thinks that you want. And then you want to come out of the gate and just bid a couple times super quick, like online, like bid $2 and then he goes 3, you go 4, and he goes 5, you go 6, and then stop. And I don't care if it's too cheap, just let him have him. Because number one, you're filling a spot. And number two, you're teaching him that what I just did was unpredictable. So he's going to be a little bit more wary tailing you in the future.
That's interesting. Okay, so you even if it's not burning his budget, it's still burning a roster spot, and that inherently carries value. Okay.
Yep. And that's something that I talked about on my show recently that I have not been very good about stressing, but roster spots have value late in a draft.
Yeah, you have
over and above just, hey, I got this nice deal. Well, your nice deal shut you out of somebody better. So roster spots themselves take on value. And I just like getting guys on their team because a lot of times then too, even if they don't know you did it, like you gave them a player for $6 and they're like, sweet, I got this nice deal. Well, they feel better. They move on. They're like, okay, now I got to focus on RB3. And then you're freed up to get your wide receiver that you actually wanted.
Would you, if you're doing this, are you still nominating somebody that at the end of the day you're okay getting stuck with, or are you swinging for the fences and gambling? Okay.
Yeah, I'm careful. It depends how late. When we're real late, I'm careful not to nominate somebody that I don't want because I hate that feeling that you get stuck with somebody you don't want. You're like, I just burned a roster spot. Everyone else has 16 spots. Now I have 15. So I can't stand that late. But when we're in the middle to like 3/4 of the way through, there's still plenty of guys left. I'm going for somebody I don't want. And I'm really just not wanting to burn more than $4 or $5 on a play like that. Because if I do get somebody like that super cheap, at least I got them super cheap. It's okay. I can come back from it. But near the end, you got to be real careful.
Okay. So now we'll talk about a little more specific things here. What makes a good auction target, and who are some of your targets?
Yeah. So one of the things that I always talk about is targets don't have to be cheap guys. Targets can be guys that you believe have value above their ADP. So what I like to do is I like to look at ADP from snake drafts and just go through and say, which guys are falling past where you think they should fall. That is going to clue you in as to what guys you might be able to find a big deal on. And auctions are different. We're like, okay, I got this guy in the 7th round. He should have gone in the 6th. Okay, that's a good deal. But in auctions, a lot of times that stuff can fall off a cliff. So you can be talking about a guy who's a wide receiver 3 who may go for 13 or $14 at a certain point in the draft. Later in the draft, you might get him for 5. So there's a massive gap that you can find in the right spots. So the reason I say that is because targets can be any level. They can be elite, they can be mid, they can be late. But what you're doing is looking for players that the general fantasy community is a little bit down on. That's why I mentioned Dak Prescott. People, I don't know, the dude had 38 touchdowns last year, and everybody's like, it's kind of boring. He lost to Amari Cooper, and you're like, I think he's a good quarterback. I'm okay with that in an auction. So targets are guys that either have injury bias from last year, are in situations that people are not excited about, And I end up in some of my deeper auctions, walking away with some guys on bad teams that nobody wants. I won a lot of leagues in the past couple of years, and really deep leagues with Jets wide receivers and Jags wide receivers. And so those are guys nobody wants. You get to the end of the draft, you get these guys for $1 or $2, and you're getting 65 catches and 700 yards in a 14 teamer. That's gold. Those are the way you isolate some targets like that. So a couple guys, I mentioned Dak already. Russell Wilson's another guy. I don't understand the recency bias here. The dude's been awesome for 10 years and he has one finger injury and everybody's out on him. Deontay Johnson's somebody, and this is an example of somebody that I was talking about earlier when I say Deontay Johnson should be treated as a wide receiver 2 this year. I get that you can't put him in wide receiver 1 territory, even though he was PPR wide receiver 7 last year. I get that with the uncertainty there and possible volume issues, he could fall down in the wide receiver 2 range. But in an auction, my builds, I want Deontay Johnson as my wide receiver 4 if I can.
Okay.
And so that's what I mean when I talk about targets. Because I think he can be cheaper, it doesn't mean that I'm going to get him cheap and go wide receiver 2, then I'm going to go buy Jonathan Taylor. Instead, I stick him at my wide receiver 4 and I get a couple other better guys. 2 other guys I'd mention before we move on is Aaron Jones is one. He's mid to late second in snake drafts, which tells me that I might be able to get him for less than $40. If I can do that, I'm absolutely running with Aaron Jones as my RB1.
I love it. Yeah.
And then Dalvin Cook's the other guy. And I said you want to nominate him super early, but I don't think it's going to matter when you nominate Dalvin Cook. I think that he's a guy that you might be able to get for $45 this year. And if you can, I'm in on Cook for 45 or less.
Cool. Yeah. I also am very high on Aaron Jones. I think that his target volume this year is just going to be through the roof with Adams gone, and people should be nervous or will be nervous about possible suspension for Cook. To your point about the abstract point about comparing snake draft to ADP, I thought that was really interesting. And I guess, do you find that the action of having to actually place a bid on someone rather than just kind of selecting the next guy in the snake draft queue, does that create a scenario where guys who are falling in general ADP will maybe fall further because of that act of actually having to give up the budget? Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, you actually nailed it, because when people actually have to commit their money to that player, they realize how much they don't like them. And it's like, okay, well, this is like when I'm in the 8th round of a draft and I'm like, there's all these other guys. I don't really like this guy, but he's definitely the best of what's left. Then it's free. It's a free roll when you're in a snake, because you get to take him. And it doesn't cost you anything, but you're that draft pick that round, and you don't care because the rest of the guys are ostensibly worse. But in an auction, you don't have to. So people are oftentimes just not going to do it. And last year, like Mike Gesicki was a guy like that I found getting super cheap in all my auctions, because they're like, there's 13 other tight ends that I would be fine with. I ended up walking out of most draft rooms with Gesicki for less than $5. And I just thought that he had potential to be good enough that $3 was ridiculous. And that's what I mean. Like, people aren't going to price enforce because they don't care. So they're never going to open their mouth. So you nailed it. You got it exactly right.
Okay. Are there any late round targets that you want to touch on?
Yeah. So again, the reason I say that I go to snake ADP is because targets generally are a product of general fantasy football consensus, as I said a minute ago. So that gives me an idea who doesn't, what people don't care about at this point. And a couple of these guys that I've been looking at, a guy that may not be a late, quote, late target, but Ramondre Stevenson is somebody that I'm targeting in my particular builds because I bail out of RB2 so much. I'm hoping I can go in, probably not in like Sharky rooms. Am I going to get Stevenson for a deal? But in my home leagues, hey, I think that I can get Stevenson for like $10 or $12. He's a perfect RB2 in my build. And then late, I'm talking, I like KJ Osborne this year because I think he's going into his 3rd year. He didn't play a lot his rookie year. Last year, he played in 3 wide receiver sets, but when he had the chance when Thielen was out, he was productive. And the Minnesota Vikings, according to Sharp Football, are in the past couple of years ran 11 personnel the least of any team in the NFL. So they had 3 wide receivers on the field, the least amount of times of any team out there. This year they get a Nathaniel Hackett, McVay, coaching tree, if I'm not right. But
Kevin O'Connell, yeah.
What did I say?
Hackett. Well, sorry. McVay, yeah, he was the passing game. Kevin O'Connell is from McVay's passing game.
Yes, right. Gotcha. Yep. Okay. So anyway, so I believe they're going to run a lot more 11, and that's part of the reason I like Cook. But also, I think that gets Osborne on the field more. And a lot of people, Thielen's a guy that, again, I might end up with in a lot of my auctions because he's falling as well. But everybody's like, Thielen's on the age cliff. He's like, all his metrics are going down. His yards per route run, his whatever his efficiency metrics are falling off a cliff. But yet they're not drafting KJ Osborne. I don't get it. If you really think Thielen's about to fall off a cliff, the natural successor is Osborne. So I'm trying to get him on as many teams as possible. And then let me quick hit because I know I'm running my mouth here.
You're good.
Sony Michel is somebody that I think you can get for $1 and just $1. I don't want you going out there spending $6.
Okay.
But $1, end of a draft. I love Sony Michel this year. Raheem Mostert is 30 years old. The dude has played more than he's played one season with more than 9 games as a feature back. He can't stay healthy. He's now 30. He's coming off a major injury. Nobody likes Raheem Mostert either, but for some reason they don't like Sony Michel. Like, who do they think is going to carry the ball? They think Chase Edmonds is going to have 375 touches. Like, Edmonds isn't your prototypical early down back. So who's it going to fall on? I think it's going to fall on Sony Michel, and he may not be somebody that you want to run out and start in the first half of the season, but I can't imagine by week 6 that the guy hasn't carved out at least a goal line role, and maybe Mostert's on the sidelines or Edmonds is banged up. Whatever the reason may be, there's 3 dudes there that are going to share the ball, and if one of them's eliminated from the equation, it's wheels up on Michel. David Njoku is a guy that I want to wait on the Watson stuff before I go too heavy on him. But Rich Rebar was on my show this week, and he made a great point. He said, Jacoby Brissett loves the tight end. So if Brissett ends up being their starter this year, I don't think you can just hate Njoku because Watson's not there. And then one other guy that I really like that I know he's getting a little bit more popular. So I don't really want to pay $8 for this guy, but if I can get Nico Collins for less than $5, I'm going to try to do that. It sounds to me like he's setting up to be the guy running on the other side of Brandon Cooks. And I like Davis Mills. I think that's not a hot take, but I like Davis Mills. And I think Nico Collins showed flashes at the end of last year. His metrics weren't, they're so, but they're good enough that he's going to get the volume. He's going to get the chance. And then one guy that's way out of left field, Noah Brown in Dallas. I know that's wild, but who's going to play there? Gallup isn't healthy yet. James Washington's 6 to 10 weeks. And James Washington, let's be honest, has never been a guy that stayed healthy for long stretches. Who's going to catch passes there? Dalton Schultz. Now, I don't know this myself, but everybody who comes on my show says Dalton Schultz is a jag. He's going to have problems producing this year without any Amari Cooper and all these guys. So who's catching passes? Noah Brown's been there. He knows the system. He's flashed in short stints. So I love him for $1 in super deep leagues.
Cool. Okay. So I want to recap some of these. Noah Brown's super interesting. I love Nico Collins, and he has the traditional X receiver profile. He's a big dude, pretty athletic. You're right. Some of the metrics from last year were not great, but I think, it might have been like Ben Gretsch. I don't remember who brought this up, but actually it might've been Larky. He had, I think 4 300-yard games last year, Mills, and that was the same as the rest of the rookie class combined. I think that the Pep Hamilton scheme is fantastic. Mills and Nico Collins are my 2 most stacked players on Underdog, actually.
Pep Hamilton, that's not to be taken lightly.
No.
Wherever he goes, quarterbacks play well with him. So there's something he's doing.
Yeah. And I think the Osborne point is great. And I didn't know that Minnesota's 3 wide receiver sets were so infrequent last year, but that makes perfect sense that they're going to crank it up with the McVay system there. Osborne will probably play the like Van Jefferson role, or phrased differently, probably maybe Brandon Cook's role. Thielen, I like Thielen a lot because he's probably going to play X, and that role and that system is what we saw Robert Woods and Odell Beckham Jr. play last year. It's what Allen Robinson's playing this year. I like that a lot. I like Dean a lot too.
Yeah, I'm going to look up his ADP while you're talking because
Okay.
it's crazy to me. Go ahead.
And so another point with KJ Osborne though is Irv Smith just had thumb surgery a few days ago, and he was expected to take a leap forward this year. I think that he last I saw, he's expected to be ready week 1, but thumb surgery and not playing for the duration of training camp is not going to help him get off to a hot start. So I like those picks there. And so I think and Sony Michelle. So Michelle is interesting. I mean, so Mike Daniel came in and he signed 3 starters to compete with Myles Gaskin, or former starters to compete with Myles Gaskin, Chase Edmonds, Raheem Mostert, and Sony Michelle. And that's as, much of a vote of no confidence as I've ever seen. So I think Gaskin is just out. To your point, Chase Edmonds is largely a satellite back. I think he'll lead that backfield in touches this year. But if Mostert is not someone was talking about, I think it was Matthew Betts was tweeting about this the other day, that Mostert had a quarter-sized piece of cartilage missing from his knee. They had to replace. I mean, if you look at your knee and picture a quarter coming out, that's a big piece of cartilage. So
Yeah.
he's had a rough career. He's a great fun player, but rough career. The Sony Michelle thing, that's super interesting. I had not been highly considering him.
Yeah. Well, and I just to the point about Chase Edmonds, I love Chase Edmonds. Don't get me wrong. So I've been drafting a lot of Chase Edmonds too, and I actually love his price as well. But he doesn't profile as a 300 touch guy. So let's say we give him 200 or 225, but some of that's going to be receiving work, or a lot of it's going to be receiving work. There's still a couple hundred touches in that backfield, and there's still a goal line rolled up for grabs. I don't see Raheem Mostert or Myles Gaskin grabbing it. I see Sony Michelle grabbing it. So I could be wrong, but it's $1. And who cares if he's your RB6 for $1 at the end of an auction, and you end up with a guy that you can play on bye weeks and injuries. Or if Mostert goes down, he ends up being a guy that's getting 12, 13, 14 touches a game. That's a home run for $1 pick.
Agreed. And I also really like Ramondre. That dude, his access to an upside season is crystal clear. James White is still limping. Ramondre he's competing with a rookie in Pierre Strong for passing down work. I think that Strong is great. I think he's a great prospect, but Ramondre already showed us that he is great in both facets of the game last year. And as the season progresses, I'm not going to be surprised if they start to phase Damian Harris out because his contract is up and they just give this offense to Ramondre. I like that pick a lot. Did you have any more you wanted to add on that?
No, that was the only thing I was going to say about Ramondre is I would remind everyone listening that that's a home league play. I don't think you're going to get in a room of sharks and get a deal on Ramondre Stevenson. Everybody like me and Nick, we know that he looks poised to take that next step. And he went through Bill Belichick boot camp last year already. So I'm hoping he does something.
Yeah. All right. Being the auction guru, what have I failed to ask you about?
What have you failed to ask me about? Oh, that's a great question. I think that the biggest thing that people don't talk about in auctions is the amount of sort of determination and doggedness it takes to compile a full roster. It is hard to sit down in an auction, whether it's online or live, it doesn't matter. It is hard to sit down and pay attention for 3 or 3.5 hours. It is a grind. So the one thing I always just tell people is mentally prepare yourself for a different experience and know that it's going to be harder. You're going to come out of it a little tired, like wrung out a little bit. And you should feel that way. If you come out of it like, that was a lot of fun, like maybe you didn't do it right. Like, you're going to have fun. Don't get me wrong. The competition's fun, but you have to pay attention to every single thing that's going on in the room. And I don't know that people are prepared for that. So it may just be the school of hard knocks. When you get in your first one, you realize, whoops, I wasn't ready for this. But if I can give you that bump now, like, hey, your preparation needs to be better than it's ever been. And your mental focus and attention to what's happening in the room needs to be better than it's ever been. At least you'll have that expectation, going forward.
Cool. I love it. All right. Drew, can you tell all the people where they can find your work?
Yeah, thanks. You can find my writing about auction stuff. It's now called Salary Cap on Football Guys. You can find the writing over there. And if you want to find me on Twitter, it's Drew Davenport FF. TikTok is Fantasy Football Lawyer. I do a lot of legal updates on TikTok. It's not a lot of fantasy related content, but you can find that stuff on Twitter and at Football Guys. And then of course my show. That's the biggest thing. I am excited about the show and the direction it's taken this year. I wasn't sure how it would do in the second year, but the auction brief is the name of the show. Hopefully you can tune in and get more tips like we've talked about here.
Yeah, it's great. I recommend everyone goes and listens to it. Part of my weekly rotation. All right. Thank you so much, Drew. I appreciate your time. Appreciate you coming on here, and have a good rest of your week. Hope to talk to you again.
Thanks for having me, Nick. And thanks again for being a big supporter.
Yeah, no problem. See ya.